Imagine a place on the internet where everything is true. It's a fairly important, well, pretty important place. It's a place that contains all the principles and concepts and ideas that between us we think are important. Um, not necessarily big philosophical ideas, but stuff that we think helps make society work, stops us squabbling incessantly. It'd be a place where you go to see who gets to be a citizen, um, who's allowed to carry a gun, who can get married, and to who. Um, and this stuff is true. This is a true place because between us, we've given it authority, um, and this is the law. Um, and I like to think of the law as our operating system. Um, um, our law and operating system is a fantastic idea. You to write down and agree the rules to our society. It's an amazing achievement. And it's the story of any nation, really, any country's history. Their story is told through the evolution of their operating system. So going back to the 19th century, Britain just finished a long, ruinous war against Napoleon. Britain and the whole of Europe essentially has been plunged into a deep recession. London is filled with thousands and thousands of discharged soldiers and sailors. They've got no work, no job, no money, no food. So Parliament responds with a number of punitive statutes, including the 1824 Vagrancy Act, which punishes idle and disorderly persons, vagabonds with hard labour. And still parts of it are much, even though it's been amended significantly since, there's still parts of it that are in force. And I say this because law is important, and I think it's really interesting. I genuinely think most people find it very interesting as well. And I'll set those reasons out now because I'll start with the two qualities that got me into it, and more specifically government law. It's important and interesting, yes, but there's one aspect that's a bit different. And that's what happens when you try to use the law, when you try to check the law, see if you're complying. And then you find it's a completely miserable experience. It's a miserable process because the user finds law complicated and difficult. It's difficult to navigate, it's confusing, it's hard to understand. And that's concerning, that troubles me. It should trouble all of us because law is important and it affects us all. So how did it get into this state? Talk about law being an operating system. What virus has infected our operating system? So you might start with the volume of the law. There's maybe I think I read there's about 50 million words in force in our statute book, which is nuts. So what happens when you try to find something in this great mountain of words? Maybe you're looking for the law on fingerprints is always an example I like to use. You look for a law on fingerprints, you find a statute called the Fingerprints Act 1926, which doesn't exist, I made it up. But so you find that, then you find it's been amended about 30 times in 30 years. So you're looking for the amended version. Then you discover that some of the amendments are not in force yet. So you look for a real-time version with the prospective amendments sort of circling overhead. And then you discover that there's an act somewhere else that's meant to help you define what a finger is. It might say that when the word finger is used in a statute, it includes the words thumb. So that's another thing you have to consider. And then you get your head around that, and then you discover something called the fingerprint regulations. It's just an absolute mess. You would give up and go home. Why would you pursue this? So it's law is difficult and it's complicated and it's not easy for the user. There's a good friend of mine that says if there was a wall map of the statute book, some bits would be so confusing that the cartographer would just give up, and just go home because it can be so difficult. And further to that point, the only tool that they have when writing law is words and sentences and numbered paragraphs, essentially. It's been the same technique for thousands of years. And they're asked to achieve enormous amounts of detail, um, which means you have to include more and more words. Yeah, so that comes at the expense of readability. So you have this sort of paradox between of precise language, where you achieve certainty at the expense of clarity, really. Um, the language is it's not jargon, but it's got a sort of deadening quality. It's you know, you have to use precise words. You can't use expressive, colorful language. Um, or you can't rhetorical language either. Um, if you read a good novel or something, the words that are used in that novel are not really words that you're going to find in the statute book. If I was to ask people what their favorite words are, you'd probably get words like joyful or, I don't know, quizzical, purple, tulip. Those aren't words that are used in the statute book. And people wouldn't say their favorite words are necessary or satisfactory or schedule or commence, which is all the sort of words that make up a lot of the language used in the statute book. So that makes it a huge challenge for the people making laws and drafting them, for parliamentarians and people trying to lobby change, because it's a collaborative process. These people that I've just named are all collaborators in an operating system, sort of by virtue of its complexity and architecture and form, but they're a million miles away from what is usable for the average citizen, for the user. So you obviously have this challenge, but I don't think we should despair. I think there's actually a case to be optimistic about it, and that the law and people's experience of the law can get better. And I think there's a few principles you have to start with. First being, don't make it worse. Okay, it might seem a bit obvious, but don't make it worse. You've already got 50 million words of statute. Why don't we just try not add to it unless we have to? You could legislate less or in less detail. What happens if you have fewer rules? What happens if you leave more to trust or to common sense? What are behavior? What are incentives? And let's just not make bad law. So I'll start with that. Second point, make it better. Again, bit obvious. Let's make it better. How do we do that? Law is complicated. It's a very complicated system. Hundreds of complicated systems exist in our society. We shouldn't be terrified of complexity anymore. We've got tools, computing power, and ability to deal with complexity and bring it to order. So the same applies to the law here. I don't think we should think of law as just language, but as data. 50 million words of law, as we said before. That's not a pile of words necessarily. That there's data. There's going to be patterns within that, so we can use tools at our disposal to manage that and manipulate it and make it available in a way that suits the user, just as they do in healthcare and data. Weather data, for example. So I think law to me is not just language; it's data. Just to continue that sort of extended metaphor as law as a sort of operating system, because I genuinely believe that. I genuinely think that is a fair way of looking at the system. And on that point, I think we can borrow from other sectors. We can borrow from information science and from software engineering. Techniques like design patterns. They don't use the sort of language that is used in these sectors in Parliament or the Palace of Westminster, but it needs to become part of the language of lawmaking, I reckon. We need to look at the form and architecture. Maybe it's time to move away from sequential time-stamped documents. It might be convenient to Parliament and, granted, interesting. Historians or amateur historians, that is interesting, but it's completely baffling to the average user, and that is not, I do not think that is patronizing to say. It's completely baffling because it's a very complex system. So maybe we need to move away from this. We need to put the law at the service of the people, rather than letting it be something that gets in the way and confuses everyone. We need to achieve clarity, is what I'm saying here. We need to achieve clarity in the law. I wonder whether there are some areas of existence in life that is simply too complicated to be regulated by, this technique of numbered sentences and paragraphs. Because I think the law is probably the only modern discipline that only uses language. They don't use symbols or pictures or sounds. And that is a big restriction. If I was to ask someone watching this to describe in great detail and precision the Milky Way, using only words and numbered paragraphs, that would be utterly ludicrous. That would be extremely difficult. Even though I would enjoy, reading some of those submissions, it would be absolutely ludicrous to expect that. Or if you're drafting a bit of road traffic law aimed to be read by the driver, that makes sense. Then we've got robots driving on our roads now. What happens then? My words, these words must be turned into computer code. Does the code become the law? These are all questions that we need to be engaging with, because society is changing in this manner, and I can't help but feel the law is being left behind a little bit. But my to return to my case for optimism, despite my slight ranting, I think it is going to get better, because the operating system is still in our hands. You've got legislation.gov.uk, which is being accessed by records amount of people, which means that the law's no longer imprisoned in law libraries or in advocates' chambers or Palace of Westminster. It's readily accessible for the user. It's out there and people are using it, which is good. And the more people that use it means that the more people demand improvement and better improvement. They will innovate and pressure people drafting these laws and businesses to draft for us, so that the law we all use makes sense for us. And that is a good thing. And that needs to continue, because law, our operating system, is something we should feel comfortable by and not alienated by. It belongs to us. It's our operating system. It's our law. So I genuinely would encourage everyone to take part in this campaign to change the law for the better, reclaim it, and get involved, because it shapes all of us. It shapes society. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.